I want you to go back to Bancroft Hall, which was the residence hall for all of the midshipmen at the Naval Academy. And I want you to go down to the basement where the payphones are. And I want you to call your parents. And I want you to tell them what I said. And I want you to have a pen and a paper and write down exactly what your mother says. And then I want you to type me a letter and tell me exactly what your mother said and mail it to me. And the commander's going to give me my address. He goes, now get out of here. And so I got up and I walked out. And again, I break the plane of Rickover's door only this way on the way out. And the commander turns around and he shakes my hand and he says, welcome to the program. And I was like, what?
Hello, Culminators. Thanks for joining us once again. I want you to meet a friend of mine. Very, very fascinating and impressive person. And Jim and I actually have met in person. See, you thought I was going to say we never met in person. No, Jim and I have met in person. We both share the distinction of being part of the Legal Insurrection family of fine products. Jim will tell you about his work in his approximately third career or post-retirement career as a writer and of counsel and research fellow to the Equal Protection Project that our friend Bill Jacobson runs, doing extremely important work. But, well, let me give you, before I throw Jim up there, I'm gonna put on the screen the short version of the story, because we also share the distinction of being lawyers and intellectual property litigators, but the similarity really tends to end pretty fast after that. He's a retired U.S. Navy captain, former commanding officer of the USS Toledo, an improved Tomahawk-capable Los Angeles class attack submarine, and I'm glad they improved them. I was so sick of how they were before. Master after the Naval Academy, master's degree in mechanical engineering and national security affairs, Cornell law with honors, registered patent attorney, intellectual property litigation associate at two of the finest firms in America, Fried Frank and Robinson and Cole, former 11th Circuit law clerk and district court law clerk, and also the person who collided with the Kursk. We'll talk about that maybe a little bit, because it's actually something that, no, we won't. Okay.
Oh, man.
Jim, there are, from time to time, one will meet a military veteran in the legal profession. But those times are actually not that common. You also don't tend to meet them to be former officers. Maybe I know one guy who was a naval pilot, who was a partner at a firm that did not make me a partner, like so many others. But an intellectual property litigator, of course, it makes sense with your engineering background that you would have been drawn to real IP, not soft IP. But let's unwind it a little bit, because most people have never even met a submarine commander, and I have. How you come from a Navy family, right?
Right.
Tell us about your dad, as you told me when we spoke last
Sure.
time.
So my dad, actually my family, just to go back a little bit further, is from the hinterlands up way northeast of Montreal, Canada, in French Quebec, and from a town called Sherbrooke, Quebec. And they were basically starving to death in the early 1900s, and decided during the Roaring '20s, since everybody was getting rich in America, that they would migrate down to the United States. And they all did. Unfortunately, they were a little late to the game, and they happened to get here just right around the time that the stock market was crashing. And actually, my dad was born in 1929. And he was actually born in my grandparents' home because they were so poor they couldn't afford to actually go to the hospital or go to a doctor to have, their children born.
Now, where did they land? Where were they in the U.S.?
They were in Lawrence, Massachusetts, and there was a big French-speaking community there. And so they had my dad, I can remember my dad's stories about the French social club and all of this kind of thing. And my dad eventually, as a kid, listened to the radio during World War II. And in 1946, right after the war, when he was 17, he joined the Navy. And due to his fascination with the radio broadcasts about submarine operations in World War II, he decided to join the submarine force and went in obviously as an enlisted guy, was an electrician in submarines, which is actually a very important job, especially on diesel submarines, because the diesel generators powered the batteries, which were humongous in those old diesel submarines. So when they were submerged, they had power to.
Was he entirely trained in being an electrician in the service?
Yeah. So he was an electrician from the beginning to the end. But in the late 50s, interestingly enough, he was one of the first enlisted guys drafted by Hyman Rickover into the nuclear power program. So in the late 50s, he went to nuclear power school, which back then was very interesting because they all wore civilian clothes, and the reactor plant manual that they used to operate the reactor plant, he told me, was about an inch thick. And now it's about 18 volumes, about a foot thick each. But anyways, he did that, and so I was born in 1959, right when he was going through that training.
So hold on a second. So you and I know who Hyman Rickover is.
Oh yeah.
But there are some younger people who do not appreciate what a big deal he was in the 1950s, and for quite some time after that.
Yeah, Hyman Rickover basically is not only the father of Navy nuclear power, he is really the father, in my mind, of nuclear power in general. He took the concepts, of the early researchers, Enrico Fermi and all those guys, and he said, we're going to take this thing, and instead of building a huge power plant on land, power cities, we're going to jam it into a tiny submarine and make it so that that submarine can go around the world underwater at any speed it wants, whenever it wants, for years. And people thought he was nuts. And obviously he ended up doing that, exactly that. And so my dad was a submariner. I can remember going down on his submarine when I was about 3 or 4 years old and eating ice cream in the chief's quarters and I can remember the vertical ladders you have on submarines. I can remember going up and down the ladder like this because I was only about 3 feet tall or whatever. And I absolutely was fascinated by it and thought it was the coolest thing ever. And I thought my dad was cool.
That's good. That's good.
I can remember when we were in high school, I was helping my dad renovate our basement, and he looked at me one day, I think I was a sophomore in high school, and he said, "What are you going to do?" And I knew exactly what he meant right then. I don't know how, but what he meant was, what are you going to do for a living when you get out of high school? And I said, well, I'm going to join the Navy like you did. And he said, well, okay. I don't mind if you join the Navy, but if you're going to do that, you really ought to go in as an officer and not as an enlisted guy. And I was like, well, why? And he said, well, the pay is better, the food's better, the accommodations are better, everything's better about being an officer. And so I said to him, well, why didn't you do that? And he said, well, my family was poor, we couldn't afford to go to college. And I said, but I know that there are officer programs in the military where when you're an enlisted guy, you can go from being an enlisted guy to an officer. Why didn't you do that? And he said, well, by the time I was eligible for those programs, I was a chief petty officer, electrician, in charge of the electrical division on a submarine, and I was the captain's right-hand man for anything that went wrong with the electric stuff all over the boat. Said I didn't want to do that and go from that to being the lowest guy on the totem pole as an ensign, as an officer. So, I just kind of was the master of my domain, and I didn't really want to give that up. He said, but you're starting out fresh, so that's what you ought to do. So I was like, And so I thought about that for a long time. And
also, he enlisted right at a great time, not only in terms of the technological curve of the nuclear sub program, but everyone else was like the armed forces were going from millions to not a World War I level, but everybody was being rolled, sent back home.
Right.
So there was lots of opportunity. I mean, was being a French Canadian like what was that any kind of problem for him in the Navy?
Yeah, I don't think so. He never talked about that, although he
He doesn't
always
sound
did.
like a big complainer, though. If you didn't know about the difference between enlisted men and officers, unsurprisingly, I'm guessing your dad was not was not a complainer.
Yeah, no. Yeah, he was an interesting guy. He spoke with a little bit of an accent because English was actually a second language. They spoke French in his house when they were growing up, even in Lawrence, Massachusetts. But so he, fortunately, also for me, my older brother ended up going to the Naval Academy. He was 3 years ahead of me. And so that happened right around this time. My dad and I had this conversation. So I was in this dilemma about whether to go to the Naval Academy or whether if I could get in, or whether I should go to, for instance, a civilian college and get a ROTC scholarship, or whether, or what I was going to do. And I decided in the end to go to the Naval Academy after I got in. Although it was a little bit of a tough decision because I figured, well, I don't know if I'm going to stay in for a long time or if I'm just going to do my commitment time and then get out or what. But if I'm going to stay in for a long time, I might as well go to the Naval Academy where I, get presumably the best training that, a naval officer can get. So that's what I did. And that's how I ended up there.
So you graduated in
Yeah, 1981.
the Naval Academy in 81, right? So,
Yeah,
also not a bad time to come into the service because Reagan has just taken office
right.
and he's building the Navy up to the was supposed to be the 700 ship Navy under Layman.
Yeah. Yeah, that obviously never exactly happened, although there was a great boost in Navy force, not only the ships, but people, the pay that we received. We got a big pay raise in like 1982 or 83. I forget exactly when it was, but it was like 11%. Everybody was like going crazy. But yeah, so I ended up, when I graduated from the Naval Academy, going into the submarine force like my dad, which has been my goal all along. And I can remember at the Naval Academy, I was sitting in my room one day, just kind of staring out the window, trying to decide what I wanted to do. And one of my buddies from Whippany, New Jersey, came into my room, Tom Yavorsky. We're still good friends. And he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm thinking about, what I want to do." He's like, "What do you mean you're thinking about what you want to do?" I'm like, "Well, I'm kind of thinking about going in the submarine force, but I'm also kind of thinking about being a naval aviator because that seems really cool, like flying jets off of an aircraft carrier. But my eyes are bad. My eyes have always been bad, so I have to wear glasses. So I can't be a pilot. So I'd have to be a back seat guy, and I don't know if the pilot screws up and we crash, and I could die, and that might be bad." He goes, "Don't even think about that. Submarining is in your blood. You were born to be a submariner. Just go submarines." And I was like, well, I never really thought about it like that, but maybe you're right. So
Now, going into the submarine service, though, wasn't just merely a box to check off.
no, no. So there was quite a involved screening process. And the ultimate screening process, of course, was going to be personally interviewed by Admiral Hyman G. Rickover at the Naval Reactors headquarters in Washington, D.C.
Who is still in office,
Yes.
right? I think Carter had to crowbar him out of there finally.
Yeah. Yeah. No, actually, he ended up retiring, I want to say in 85, 84, 85. And Ronald Reagan actually had to sit him down and say, "Hey, you're approaching 80 years old, and you've been on active duty for like 55 years or whatever. It's time to go." And so it was actually kind of monumental when he retired.
Yeah.
And everybody's like, kind of like in football, who's going to replace Tom Brady? Who's going to replace Hyman Rickover? But
Now, Hyman
yes,
Rickover, just to familiarize people, not a French Canadian,
no,
different
no.
kind of background.
Yeah, Rickover was an interesting guy. He actually was Jewish and was a graduate of the Naval Academy in, I believe, in the 1920s. and actually encountered some amount of anti-Semitism when he was at the Naval Academy, is my understanding, although I'm not an expert on that.
Did he speak with an accent?
No, no, not
So he grew
particularly.
up in the United States.
Yeah, I believe so. Yep. Yep. But he went on to be one of the most famous admirals of all time in the United States Navy. And the groundbreaking work that he did with submarine force is just incredible. I mean, if you read a bunch of the stories, which I would encourage all of your listeners to do about him, I mean, he was a guy who was very much no nonsense when it came to nuclear power. And there's kind of an apocryphal story about his engineers came to him when they were developing the very first reactor for submarines. And they said, okay, you know, we've been working on this shielding for this thing because this thing's going to put out a bunch of radiation. And, you know, we got to protect the sailors, but there's no way to do that. You know, we're going to need a waiver from Congress because we're going to have to expose these submarine sailors to all of this radiation. And it's 100 times above the limit, you know, that's been set by I think it was the Atomic Energy Commission way back when. And Rickover threw his pen down and stood up and started yelling at him and said, not only are we not going to apply for a waiver 100 times below or above the limit, you guys are going to figure out a way to build a shield for that reactor that only exposes submarine sailors to a radiation amount 100 times below the limit.
Wow.
And they were all like, what? And it was like, it can't be done. And he said, get out of my office and you know, come back when you have a plan for how it's going to be done. And he threw him out of his office. And sure enough, about 3 months later, they all kind of tromped back in and said, okay, we figured it out.
Wow. That's
And
wild. I didn't. So that he had this incredible force of will.
yeah, yeah. And they came back and they came up with this incredible plan to shield the reactor and you know, protect the submarine sailors that were going to serve on board submarines with these reactors. And in fact, by the time I got into command, the shielding had been advanced so much that you know, obviously I can't go into any great detail on this, but the
You'll
amount
have
of
to kill
radiation
all of
that
us.
I received from the reactor was so minimal. It was basically, I mean, it wasn't nothing, but it was pretty close to, you know, it was less than I'm getting right now, probably from the sun that's coming in through the window. So, you know, it was amazing the work that his people did to make this thing habitable. But yeah, so I had to go be interviewed by Rickover, which after, you know, if he's going to throw a team of the most brilliant engineers out of his office, you know, the students at the Naval Academy stood little chance of surviving the human flamethrower that was Hyman G. Rickover. And so I had the pleasure of going to DC and spending an entire day there at Naval Reactors. And it consisted of 3 interviews with 3 of his engineers who obviously had my academic record in front of them and knew that I was a mechanical engineer and grilled me each for about an hour and a half each on all different, everything I had studied, you know, everything from air conditioning to turbines to structural mechanical stuff.
No gender studies or
What's that?
no gender studies or
Yeah, no, we didn't touch on that as I recall.
okay.
But yeah, so and then we all went into a big room and we're sitting in these little very uncomfortable chairs and they started calling in people in. This is probably 4 o'clock in the afternoon, calling people in to be interviewed by Rickover. And I sat there for at least a half hour and they finally called my name and I got up and of course I've been my Naval Academy midshipman uniform. I was a senior, I believe it was September of right at the beginning of my senior year. And they said, okay, follow me. And it was a guy in civilian clothes, but it had been pointed out to us that he was a commander, actually a former submarine captain. And he was in civilian clothes, but he was one of Rickover's close advisors on the submarine community. And he said, walk through that door, go into Rickover's office, sit in his chair, and answer all his questions. And I said, okay, sir, sounds good.
Sit in his guest chair, obviously.
Yeah. So yeah, Rickover's guest chair. And I'm walking down the hallway towards his office, and I can see Rickover's door, and I can see him in the distance. And I'm like, wow, that's Rickover? And he had this big leather chair, and he was this little guy. At this point, he was probably 80 or 78 or 80, 79, 80 years old. And he was like this little tiny guy sitting in this chair. He kind of looked like Yoda, you know? And I literally broke the plane of his office door, and he screamed at the top of his lungs, "Why are your grades so bad?" And I stopped like a deer in the headlights, and the commander behind me literally pushed me into his office and said, "Go sit in the chair." And I sat down in Rickover's chair. And so now I'm about 4 feet from Rickover. He's on the other side of his desk, obviously sitting in his big chair. And I was just staring there with this blank look. And he says, "Why are your grades so bad?" And I thought about it, and I didn't know what to say, and I couldn't lie. You know, you can't lie to a 4-star admiral, which is what he was at this point. And so I thought, and I thought, and I thought. I said to him, "Well, maybe, you know." And at this point, I had probably a 3.2 grade point average in a very, very challenging mechanical engineering program of study, which was known throughout the academy at that time as being one of the two, mechanical and electrical engineering, as being the two most difficult programs of study at the Naval Academy. So I thought I was doing pretty good, but he didn't, obviously. And so I said to him, "Well, Admiral, you know, it could be that there were times, occasionally, when I didn't study as much as I should have." And he goes, "Well, why didn't you study as much as you should have?" And I was like, this is going downhill rapidly. So I didn't know what to say. But again, I knew I couldn't be untruthful. And so I said to him, and I thought back there in his office, I'm thinking, well, why didn't I study so much? Like, well, you know, sometimes I like to, you know, goof off and play cards with my friends. Sometimes I like to go out, you know, the one night of the week that we're allowed to go out, sometimes, I just don't like to study. You know, what can I tell you? You know, I just don't feel like studying. So I said to him, "Admiral, I guess sometimes, on occasion, I've been a little bit lazy when it comes to my studies." And he goes, "Lazy? Lazy? You want to be in my program, my nuclear power program, and you're lazy?" He goes, "Turn around and tell that commander you want to be on his boat and you're lazy." And I was like, oh. Well, when you get an order from a 4-star admiral, you have to do it, especially when you're a midshipman at the Naval Academy. You're not even an officer yet.
In other words, you understood that when an admiral tells you that, it's not a rhetorical device. He's literally giving you an instruction, and you literally need to follow it.
Right. And there had been, for years, decades, stories about Naval Academy midshipmen that had gone to his interview and had been ordered to do things like go sit in his closet for hours on end, go out and sing a song to his secretary. It was one of the orders he had given a midshipman. Recite a poem, your favorite poem. He'd been in the habit of giving crazy orders to midshipmen previously.
And what's that about? What would be the, given that he was not a lunatic, what would be the purpose there? To see how the person dealt with the stress of being put out of his comfort zone?
Yeah. It was strictly a see how the guy reacts under stress, see if he's going to follow the order, I suppose. And so in my case, I turned around to the commander and I said, "Commander, I want to be on your boat and I'm lazy." And I turned back around and Rickover screamed at me, "You think he's going to take you on his boat?" And I said, "I guess not, Admiral." He goes, "You're damn right he's not." And so then he's looking at my file and he's got it open. He's going page by page, looking at my record. I'm sure he was looking also at the reports that he got from his 3 engineers that had interviewed me earlier in the day. And this went on for about 3 minutes, looking at my record. He closes my file and he looks and he gets very kind of conspiratorial with me and he says, you know, it could be your parents' fault. And I was like, oh my God, I'm gonna die, and I didn't say that. That's what I was thinking. And he goes, isn't it possible that two perfectly intelligent human beings could get together and produce a nitwit? And I was like, oh man, maybe
Nitwit.
I'm gonna have to go aviation after all. This is obviously going downhill, and we've reached bottom, and I don't really know what is going to happen. But obviously, I'm not going to be a submariner. And he goes, okay, here's what I want you to do. He said, I want you to go back to Bancroft Hall, which was the residence hall for all of the midshipmen at the Naval Academy. And I want you to go down to the basement where the payphones are. And I want you to call your parents. And I want you to tell them what I said. And I want you to have a pen and a paper and write down exactly what your mother says. And then I want you to type me a letter and tell me exactly what your mother said and mail it to me. And the commander's going to give me my address. He goes, now get out of here. And so I got up and I walked out. And again, I break the plane of Rickover's door only this way on the way out. And the commander turns around and he shakes my hand and he says, welcome to the program. And I was like, what?
But of course, he would never have put you through that if he didn't intend to. Like he just wouldn't have seen you. Why would he waste time with you? But you didn't get it.
It was crazy.
But there's more to the story.
We all hopped on the bus, went back to Bancroft Hall at the Naval Academy, and I immediately opened up my desk drawer in my room and got a quarter out so I could go down to the basement and put it in the payphone to call my parents. And I put a quarter in the payphone and walked down to the basement of Bancroft Hall, got in a payphone booth, closed the door, put the quarter in, called my parents, and my parents answered, and I said, hey, guess what? I had my Rickover interview today, and I'm going to be a submariner. And they're all like, woohoo, oh, that's great. Oh, we're so excited, And so then I told them about, how he was badgering me about my grades, and he didn't think I was very smart, and he thought I was, I had to tell him I was lazy sometimes, and he made me tell the commander, that I was lazy, and that the commander would never take me on his boat, and that I was a nitwit, and that you guys had produced a nitwit, and
which he had told you to tell them.
Right. And so my mom goes, that son of a bitch. And which was shocking to me because it was the first time in my life I ever heard my mother swear. And she goes, if he understood you better, he'd respect you more and he'd have more respect for you. And I just can't believe he said that. And I was like, oh my God, I'm gonna have to tell this to Admiral Rickover. So we hang up and I went upstairs and I got on my manual typewriter in my office or in my room. I got the address. I had gotten the address from the commander and I typed my letters. Dear Admiral Rickover, my mom says that you're a son of a bitch. And if you respected me more, you'd treat me with more respect. And, basically told him literally exactly what she said. So, sincerely, James Nault, midshipman first class, United States Naval Academy. And I folded it up and put it in an envelope, put a 8-cent stamp or whatever a stamp cost back then. And there were these little slots in Bancroft Hall where you could put outgoing mail in and it would go somewhere and somehow get delivered. And I was literally like, after I did that, kind of nervous walking back to my room because I just like swore at a 4-star admiral or related to a story where somebody was swearing at him, And I was nervous about that for quite some time after that. But, nothing ever happened. So that was good. And I have no idea if he ever got the letter. But somehow, miraculously, I was admitted to the submarine program. And,
And you were in there for how long?
Well, I was on submarines for about 20 years. My entire Navy career spanned 31 years total from the day I entered the Naval Academy to the day I retired. And, 31 years of challenging, sometimes very difficult work.
So you were in your mid-50s when you retired.
Yeah, I was 48,
Oh,
actually.
okay.
Yep, I went to the Naval Academy when I was 17 and I
Oh,
retired
wow.
when I was 48. Yep.
So what better thing for a 48-year-old veteran to do than go to law school?
Right. Right. So that was obviously a huge decision for me to come to, because especially that mid 2000s was the time after 9/11 where the military was really at its zenith of spending. I mean, they were spending money on the military big time to go after terrorists, and we had invaded Iraq, and there was just a lot of money to be made. Most of my peers went into defense contracting and worked for Lockheed Martin or Northrop Grumman, and basically went to DC and worked for these behemoth defense contractors, answering the call really from DoD to, help the military out, building more submarines, building more tanks, doing
You could have
intel.
gone to electric boat, I guess.
Yeah, there was a lot of that kind of thing going on. So I had those opportunities to do that. So it was a very difficult decision for me to go to law school, but I didn't really think that the defense contracting thing was for me, just because, not that there's anything wrong with it. I mean, I'm thrilled that there are people who build submarines because, they're awesome. But anyway, I just didn't think I wanted to do that. And by that time, I had 3 degrees already: the bachelor and master's degree in mechanical engineering that you mentioned, and the master's degree in national security affairs. And I was in retirement class that was run by the Air Force, actually. And we had to take this big examination, which was more of a survey than it was an exam, but basically you had to answer all these questions about the things that you like to do in your career and what you did and what you didn't do. And then they provided you these kind of a readout. I have no idea how they did it, but they provided you this readout of some suggested career paths that you could take after retirement. And near the top of my list was being an attorney. And then they basically had this little matrix where they showed you how they arrived at that. And then basically, without me really even realizing it, because the questions that they had asked were all sort of like guarded and kind of hidden in what they were actually going for. But the readout showed that I really like to study and read and write and get involved in kind of complicated things like mechanical engineering and national security issues and things like that, and that lawyers generally do a lot of reading and writing and researching and trying to figure out very complicated things, and that this might be a path for me to proceed along. And I had never even uttered the word attorney in my life, and
Was it the strong interest inventory? Was that what you took?
The what?
There's something called a strong interest inventory. Strong is the name of the
Yeah,
government.
I think it might have been that. I'm not sure. I don't remember that name.
When I took it, and the 2 top results it came up with for me were lawyer and Air Force officer.
Oh, that's so funny. Wow.
Well, my eyes were never
Kind of
very
like
bright,
karma.
and I was not Air Force material. Okay,
That's
so
funny.
but the legal profession was something that had never been part of your mind, your worldview.
Yeah, no, never. And so I started researching it, Googling lawyer, and learned a lot about it. And I thought, sounds like something that I could do. And the idea of going to school was actually very attractive to me, because I had been in the Navy for 31 years, as I mentioned. Most of that time, I had been in charge of large groups of sailors, and which was great, but it also kind of wore on me, quite frankly, after all those years, just because it's a very challenging thing to do, to manage a large group of people. It's a constant battle to keep all the plates spinning and keep everybody reasonably happy and
And a little bit of expensive hardware in there too that you had responsibility for.
Yeah. And so I was like, 3 years where I'm just in charge of myself sounds pretty attractive to me at this point.
That's
And
interesting.
so I applied to a bunch of law schools, and actually, when I made this decision, I was actually stationed at the United States Strategic Command in Omaha, Nebraska, at Offutt Air Force Base, which is why I went to the Air Force retirement thing. And I was, looking at law schools, and I figured out that the University of Connecticut Law School has this program where if you were or a resident of the state of Connecticut, or you own property in Connecticut, that they will waive your tuition to go to law school. And so I thought, wow, that sounds great. So I applied to UConn Law School. I got in, and I put my retirement papers in, and I was going to go to UConn Law School, and I got a phone call from a friend of mine at Navy Personnel Headquarters, and he told me, "We want you to rescind your retirement." And I was like, "What?" It's like, we cannot get anyone to go to Ithaca, New York, and be the commanding officer of the Navy ROTC unit at Cornell. And so we'd really like you to rescind your retirement request and go do this for at least 2 years. And I was so mad at them for even asking me to do that. And I hung the phone up, and I talked to my wife, Bonnie, about it. And she was like, "Well, why don't you just call the guy who's in the job right now?" It turns out I knew him because when I was executive officer on an attack submarine, the #2 guy, he was the captain, and he was now the commanding officer of the Navy ROTC unit at Cornell, and he was a Cornell grad. She said he knows everything about Cornell, and he's been in the job for a couple of years. He'll be able to advise you on whether you should do this. So I called him up, and he said, "Man, you got to do this job. This
Really?
job is great. The unit is great. You're in this."
Now, Ithaca is pretty far from any water.
Yeah, but all of the schools across the country, it turned out, which I didn't know until this time, that have really good engineering programs, which Cornell is one of them. MIT's another, Penn State, all of the schools that have really elite, Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh, that have elite engineering schools, all have Navy submariners as the captain of the Navy ROTC unit. And the idea is these guys, who are all post-command submarine guys, basically find the good engineering students in the ROTC unit, and they steer them towards the submarine force so that they get not only the good engineers from the Naval Academy, now you've got all these great engineers coming from Cornell and MIT and Carnegie Mellon and, Penn State, Notre Dame, wherever, So this guy was like, "This is the greatest job ever. You have to teach 3 hours a week." It's like the rest of the time you're hanging out at Cornell, you're going to the palatial gym across the street for free. You got your own parking spot out front. This is the greatest job ever. You got to do this job. So I was like, okay. And so I started researching Cornell, which I didn't know anything about. And the law school, it turns out, for ROTC professors or ROTC commanders, you're allowed to take up to 4 credits in any course in any school at Cornell. And of course, Cornell has a law school, and they have an agricultural school, and they have an engineering school, an arts and sciences school. And so I was like, wow, I could go to Cornell, take a class at the law school, and figure out if this whole lawyer thing is what I really want to do after all. So that's what I did. I took over from my old boss at Cornell as the commanding officer of the ROTC unit. And the first semester I was there, in the fall of 2006, I applied to Cornell to take a course at the law school. And at the time, I had been thinking that I would like to be a prosecutor, put bad guys behind bars, kind of like as a continuation of my military career, where I was putting, potentially, international bad guys behind bars or whatever.
Right.
And
you're a sheriff.
Yeah. And so I literally went to the Cornell Law School as a civilian off the street. No LSAT, no nothing, because I was allowed to. And I took criminal procedure as a kind of a bum off the street, and sat in the class with 100 law students, taking criminal procedure, thinking that this is going to be my path to be a prosecutor at some point. And I got this huge case book that was like this thick, and I'm trying to read this thing, and I have no idea what I'm looking at. because most of the prior reading I had done in my studies were engineering books. And in engineering books, they tell you the rule, like F equals ma. And then you read a bunch of stuff. Okay, if a rocket is going up and the mass is this much, it weighs this much, and it's got a booster that gives it this much acceleration, how much force acts on the rocket? Well,
It's
force
empirical.
equals the mass times the acceleration. Okay, yeah, I can figure that out. In law school, I give you case books, you're just reading some judicial opinion. There's no rule. I'm like, well, what the hell's this? And then, I mean, I was such a nub, a rube off the street. I'm like, why do these judges' names all start with J? Like, I was so stupid. I had no idea what I was reading. And it took me literally like 2 weeks to figure out, okay, these are opinions of appellate courts and what the game is you're supposed to read this and you're supposed to figure out what the rule is after the case is over. I'm like, wait, they don't tell you the rule up front? What the hell? And, but actually in the end, somehow it was kind of fascinating to do that and apply it was almost like rewiring my brain backwards, where you would read the facts of the case and the law as spelled out by the court. And then oh, okay, I get it. Yeah, if the cops come into your house without a warrant and they start ripping your stuff apart, you might have that might not be good.
Jane describes a similar experience that she had at Stanford Law.
Huh.
Obviously, a very good student, as you were, science background, and everyone else there is a history or politics major.
Right. Right.
So they're used to reading texts and then analyzing, and then she had to kind of harken back to her experience reading literature. So, okay, what's the story here? What am I supposed to take out from this? But as an engineer, I mean, she was an animal behavioral biology, but engineering, like that's really much, much less subjective. All right, believe it or not, we've used up 45 minutes. Not that it isn't fascinating, but I want you end up going to law school. You end up becoming a litigator at Fried Frank,
right,
where you were part of their
IP litigation group.
IP litigation. I asked you if you worked with Jeffrey Lewis, I think.
Yeah. No.
I always thought of Fried Frank as a strange place to have IP litigation. It's really a banking law firm.
Right.
Inside baseball. You end up at Robinson Cole, which is better known for IP litigation. How long were you in the practice?
I worked at Fried Frank for a year before I went to go clerk for Judge Joe Flatt on the 11th Circuit. And then while I was down in Jacksonville, Florida, I figured out I wanted to go back to our house in Connecticut. So that's when I wound up at Robinson Cole. I was there for a little over 6 years before I went to go clerk for Judge Bryant in the District of Connecticut.
That's a very esoteric career.
Yeah.
The clerk after, so you had been an appellate clerk first, and then you were district court clerk.
Yeah. Yeah. I actually, I don't know. I really liked clerking. I thought it was very cool. I mean, working for a judge in chambers.
But hold on a second. You had been a submarine commander.
Right.
You're the guy giving orders. You're the guy, and military. Now you're working for a district court judge. Some of the most arrogant bastards in the world. But I guess you were already older, and he knew he knew about your background. I'm sure that I'm sure some of these guys treat some of their clerks like you might have treated a midshipman, or an ensign, or who knows what, under your command. I imagine you had a more collegial relationship given your stature and your age.
Yeah,
and your experience.
Yeah, we got along great I got along great with the two judges I worked for. I also interned for Judge Wesley on the Second Circuit, and he and I got along great as well.
Your wife was a pretty good sport, following you around to all these different places.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, a lot of people don't know this, but my wife is also a retired Navy captain. She is an architect from Syracuse, actually, is her background, and she went into the Navy Civil Engineer Corps, and which is also an interesting story. And while we were married, ended up going into the reserves, and she spent 30 years in the reserves and ended up getting promoted to captain. in the Navy Civil Engineer Corps, and then retired right around the same time I did, within a year, I think, of my retirement. So,
And
yeah.
your retirement from the Navy.
Yeah.
So she had the flexibility to follow you to these
Right.
exciting and interesting.
Right.
So after
Yeah.
that second clerkship, you didn't go back to private practice.
Right. So after my second clerkship, I decided to just go ahead and completely retire. And my wife and I had owned a house in Mystic, Connecticut for many years, and it was built in 1851 and needed some major renovation. So we spent the year, I believe, of 2022 renovating our house, scraping 150-year-old wooden floors down to bare wood and refinishing them and that kind of thing. And then after about a year of doing that, and we fortunately sold our house eventually, and I was getting a little bit, I don't know what the right word is, but kind of felt the desire to keep doing legal work. And I had met Bill Jacobson back in 2008 when I was a student at Cornell Law School, and he was a clinical professor there. And we had actually gone out for dinner, and I had talked to him in his office several times at Cornell Law School. And he had just started the Legal Insurrection blog at that point. And I didn't go to him looking for a job, but I was looking for advice, because one of the things that I wanted to do as a lawyer was perhaps do some public interest law things, not like for the ACLU or anything like that, but there were and are a bunch of kind of right-leaning conservative groups out there that do a bunch of work, but I didn't know much about them. So I went in and spoke to him at some length about those groups. And, he pointed me in the direction. There's a group called FIRE, which is something, First Amendment, and individual rights and indication, or in education, something like that, that do a lot of work in the First Amendment arena in colleges. And there's a bunch of other public service, kind of public interest groups that I was kind of interested in. And I did a lot of research on those as a potential career path alternative to going, as opposed to going to work for a law firm. But what I found was that for those groups, sometimes it's even more difficult to get hired there than it is to get hired at a law firm, because
Yes.
they're very tight on money. They don't have a ton of cash to spend on employees. A lot of them are shoestring kind of operations, and it's very difficult. So, and I figured that out slowly over time, and that's why I went the commercial law firm route for the most part. But then after I retired, I got back in touch with Bill Jacobson, and I said, "Hey, I'm retired now. I'm kind of interested in getting back together, to do, maybe follow this path that I thought I was going to do, but then I ended up not doing." And so we had dinner I think it was in January of 2023. And then I started working for him, actually. And he and I are the only two people at Legal Insurrection that work on both the Legal Insurrection blog side of the house, and he was at the time forming this group called the Equal Protection Project. And so my job is to do essentially mostly military and some legal blog posting on Legal Insurrection, which I do several times a week. I'll put posts out either about the United States military or about court cases, perhaps an IP case, or other case that I know about that I'm interested in. Or the other side that I work in, that's kind of like one side of the house. And then the other side of the house that I work in is the Equal Protection Project, which Bill started in February of 2023, famously kicked off on Tucker Carlson in February 2023. And what we do as a group is litigate equal rights cases in courts and with the Office of Civil Rights at the Department of Education, and in amicus briefs that we write for various court cases. And it's very rewarding work, because the basic fundamental premise of the Equal Protection Project is that discrimination, racial discrimination, and all kinds of discrimination, but we focused initially, obviously, on racial discrimination, is an evil that should be eradicated from the country as called for by the United States Constitution. And you would think that that premise would be uncontroversial, but it turns out that there's actually people who are fighting us in every court case that want to see discrimination occur. And this was kind of a shock to me to figure this out. And I don't still really understand it, but it seems to me like discriminating against someone based on your skin color ought to be illegal. And we are in a constant battle to roll back numerous programs that are discriminating against people every day. And it's still amazing to me that that occurs.
What a story, Jim. So do you think you'll be doing this for a while?
I think so. There's a small part of me that, and I had a discussion with Bill about this a couple months ago. You know, I kind of feel like, especially after 31 years, I call it sometimes 31 years of pain in the United States Navy, and going to law school, working for 2 federal judges, you know, fighting the good fight with Bill now for over about a year and a half. You know, I kind of feel like a small part of me kind of feels like, you know, I kind of gave it the office. You know, I've done my part. You know, I had told my wife, you know, when my 20 years is up in the Navy, after I get done with my command tour, which finished literally right around my 20-year point in the Navy, I'm going to retire. I'm just going to retire, and I'm going to go, you know.
And what? Fish? What would you have done with yourself?
You know, go goof off. We go skiing every winter. You know, we'll just go buy a place in Vermont, and we'll, you know,
Yeah,
go skiing.
and what?
And
just stuck up there.
And that didn't happen. But, you know, part of me still wants to do that. So I think eventually I will do that, and I'll be perfectly happy doing that at some
perfectly
point.
entitled.
But that time's not yet, especially when you look at what's going on in the country with these groups and people that are, you know, doing things that I and you and Bill think are not right. And we have the opportunity here to push back on that. And so that's what we're doing. And I mean, part of me starts thinking, you know, if these frat boys at the University of Alabama can push back on these anti-Semites who are building these encampments at these various colleges, why can't we, with our you know, legal knowledge and legal capabilities, push back and try and roll back this tide that's trying to overwhelm us with this pro-discrimination stuff? And so that's what I'm doing, and I'll be doing that for, you know, however long I feel like it, basically.
Well,
and you know, I don't know how long that's going to be, but I'm not
hope it'll
doing
be
it
for a while longer.
I'm not full-time. I'm part-time, and I'm happy doing that. I've got plenty of other things, as I mentioned, to do. My wife and I did recently buy a place up in Vermont, spent the winter there skiing, and while doing this legal stuff as well. So you know, we're working hard at the Equal Protection Project. I'm actually working on just before I came on with you, I'm working on an amicus brief to the United States Supreme Court in the Boston Parent Coalition case, which is an incredibly important case in Massachusetts, in the First Circuit, where the court basically said that a school district can discriminate and lower the enrollment of white and Asian students. That's fine, even if they have the intent to racially discriminate, and even if the means that they use is you know, on its face maybe race neutral, but not really race neutral. That's all fine, as long as the groups that are impacted still get in at a rate that's, you know, better than their average population amount in the population. It's like, wait a second, that can't be right, you know. And so we're putting together a brief on that, and we're going to brief it to the we're going to submit that to the United States Supreme Court here
the
later
PITA
this month.
case?
Pardon me?
PITA?
Yeah, and we also know that the case I'm talking about is the Boston School Committee case. The PITA case is another one that we just filed in the United States Supreme Court. And that case involved another school district who, also in Massachusetts, by the way, who uh, unbelievably wanted to take this guy's autistic child and remove him from the school special ed program. And in a Zoom call, some of the school member administrators admitted that they basically had no good reason to remove his child from the special ed program. And then when the minutes of the meeting came out, there was no mention of that in the minutes. And so in the next Zoom call that they had to discuss this, Scott Pitta, the kid's parent, says, "Hey, last time you guys said some things that were in my favor, in my child's favor, but then you didn't put it in the minutes. And so this time I want to record this Zoom call." And they're like, "Oh no, you can't do that." And then he's like, "Well, I'm going to do it. And in fact, we're recording right now." And they were like, "Okay, goodbye." And they refused to let him, they canceled the meeting, basically, and refused to let him record their meeting because they didn't want what they were going to say be on the record, obviously. And so the First Circuit, again, he sued. He's a lawyer. Pro se, he sued in the District of Massachusetts. The District of Massachusetts threw his case out on a motion to dismiss. The First Circuit affirmed and basically said, yeah, you have the right to record government officials in the performance of their official duties, as long as it's in public and as long as you express an intent to disseminate that recording to the public, because the First Amendment's all about, the public and public rights to, see how their government officials are doing. If you're just going to use it for your private use, you don't get any First Amendment protections to record. And that rule is obviously wrong, at least in our view.
Well,
and
it's obviously wrong.
We just submitted a brief to the United States Supreme Court, basically explaining why we think it's wrong. And hopefully, at this point, the game is not to win the case. The game is to get the Supreme Court just to take the case, and then you can break out your big guns and then, shoot holes in the opposition's arguments and explain why this guy should be allowed to record these school officials who are trying to do something, that he thinks is improper to his child. So it's some good work that we got going on. We have also submitted amicus briefs on cases like these in federal appellate courts at the 11th Circuit. And even at the district court level, there was a case in the Northern District of Ohio where Progressive Insurance had this program where they would do a small business accelerator program to help out small businesses, as long as you weren't, as long as you were a minority. And there was a business owner who wanted
Roberts.
The Roberts case, and the small business owner, who was a white guy, Nathan Roberts, he said, "Hey, I want to get in on this Progressive Insurance, program. This is a good deal." But he didn't meet the criteria because he wasn't a minority. And he was like, "Wow, that's really kind of a raw deal." And so he got some help and filed suit in the Northern District of Ohio. And we went ahead and filed an amicus brief in that case to help him out. And hopefully the defendants, kind of like in the Pitta case, filed a motion to dismiss. And so hopefully we can get the court in that case to rule against the defendants and let the guy actually litigate his case.
These judges really, it's amazing. Judges and these public officials, they're shameless. I mean, they're aware that the Supreme Court has firmly ruled this is whatever was allowed before on this stuff. We're done with that. And they're just going to keep barreling ahead until they are dragged kicking and screaming, case by case.
Yeah.
Jim, an amazing story, just a slice of the highlights, but I'm really glad that you're going to give people the opportunity to get to know you a little bit better. Good for you, good for America, good for Legal Insurrection and the Foundation. And I thank you very much for culminating with me today.
Hey, thanks, Ron. It was great.
I guess I'll see you in July.
Okay.
So long.
See ya.